Eric, a devoted father and kind-hearted man, never imagined that a routine drive home would lead him into the darkest chapter of his life. One fateful evening, as he was heading home to his wife and daughter, everything changed. After a random traffic stop by Officer Rick Daniels, Eric found himself arrested and wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. Despite his innocence, Eric's pleas fell on deaf ears as the officer's lies sent him to prison for years. But what Eric uncovered in his fight for justice would not only expose the truth, it would leave a judge in tears and change his life forever. What shocking truth had been hidden beneath the officer's lies? And how did Eric's resilience and forgiveness unravel a system of corruption? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if Eric's story of strength and redemption speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The sun was setting, painting the sky in golden hues, when Eric Harper's world came crashing down. At 35, Eric was a man who had always played by the rules. He was the kind of neighbor who mowed your lawn when you were sick, the friend who showed up with a toolkit when your car broke down. But on this autumn evening, none of that mattered. "Get on the ground, now!" The shout pierced the quiet street, startling Eric as he was coming from work at Joe's auto shop. Confused, Eric turned to see Officer Rick Daniels, his face a mask of determination, gun trained squarely on Eric's chest. "Officer, what's going on?" Eric asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "I said on the ground, hands where I can see them," Daniels barked, advancing with quick, aggressive steps. Eric's mind raced. What could this be about? He slowly raised his hands, heart pounding. "Officer, please, there must be some mistake dash." But Daniels wasn't listening. In a flash, Eric found himself face down on the cold concrete, the officer's knee digging painfully into his back as cold metal handcuffs bit into his wrists. "You're under arrest for armed robbery," Daniels growled, yanking Eric to his feet. "Armed robbery? That's impossible," Eric protested, his voice rising in panic. "I don't know what you're talking about. Save it for the judge," Daniels sneered, roughly shoving Eric into the back of his patrol car. The precinct was a whirlwind of activity, but for Eric, time seemed to stand still. He sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his mind reeling. How could this be happening? He'd never even touched a gun, let alone robbed anyone. Officer Daniels strode in, a smug smile playing on his lips. Well, Mr. Harper, looks like your luck's run out." Eric leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Officer Daniels, please. There's been a terrible mistake. I was nowhere near the scene of the robbery. I'm a mechanic, not a criminal." Daniels' smile only widened. "That's not what the evidence says. We've got an eyewitness who placed you at the scene, and your fingerprints were found on a discarded weapon near the robbery site." Eric's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I've never been to that part of town, and I certainly never touched any weapon." But Daniels wasn't listening. He was too busy building his case, a case built on lies and fabricated evidence. Eric didn't know it yet, but he was up against a system that was all too willing to believe the worst about a man like him. Days turned into weeks, and Eric found himself standing in a courtroom, facing Judge Helen Armstrong. Known for her fair rulings, Armstrong had a reputation for being tough, but just. Eric clung to the hope that she would see through the lies, that justice would prevail. As the trial progressed, Eric's world crumbled around him. Officer Daniels took the stand, his testimony a web of carefully constructed falsehoods. He spoke of Eric's alleged involvement in the robbery with such conviction that even Eric began to doubt his own memories. "Your Honor," Daniels said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "I saw Mr. Harper fleeing the scene of the robbery. When we apprehended him, we found evidence linking him directly to the crime." Eric's lawyer, a public defender overwhelmed with cases, tried his best to poke holes in Daniels' story. But against the word of a decorated officer and the fabricated evidence, it was an uphill battle. When it was Eric's turn to testify, he spoke from the heart. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I swear to you I'm innocent. I've never committed a crime in my life. I'm a hard-working man, trying to provide for my family. Please, you have to believe me." As Eric spoke, he could see the doubt in Judge Armstrong's eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. In the gallery, Alyssa sat with Maya, both of them fighting back tears. The jury's deliberation was shockingly brief. When they returned with a guilty verdict, Eric felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He barely heard Judge Armstrong's words as she sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Eric Harper, based on the evidence presented and the jury's verdict, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in state prison, Judge Armstrong declared, her gavel falling with a finality that echoed through Eric's very soul. As he was led away in handcuffs, Eric caught a final glimpse of Alyssa and Maya. His wife's face was a mask of anguish, while his daughter looked lost and confused. "I love you," he called out. "I'll fight this, I promise." The prison doors closed behind Eric with a resounding clang, sealing him away from the life he knew. As he was processed, stripped of his identity, and given a number, the reality of his situation began to sink in. 10 years. A decade of his life, stolen by lies. In his cell that first night, Eric lay on the hard bunk, staring at the ceiling. How had this happened? How could a system designed to protect the innocent fail so spectacularly? As he closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the prison around him, Eric made a silent vow. He would not let this break him. He would fight, not just for his freedom, but for the truth. Little did Eric know, his fight was just beginning. The corruption that had landed him in prison ran deeper than he could imagine, a tangled web of lies and prejudice that would take years to unravel. The harsh clang of metal against metal echoed through the prison corridors as Eric Harper trudged back to his cell after another long day in the prison workshop. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when Officer Daniels had torn him away from his family, but the pain and bitterness still gnawed at him like a festering wound. As he entered his cramped cell, Eric's eyes fell on the small photo taped to the wall above his bunk. It showed Alyssa and Maya on their last visit 3 months ago. Maya was now 13, growing into a young woman without her father by her side. The sight of their faces, smiling bravely for the camera, sent a sharp pang through Eric's heart. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, his fists clenching at his sides. All because of that lying cop. Eric's mind drifted back to his life before prison, the memories as vivid and painful as an open wound. He saw himself in Joe's auto shop, the familiar smell of oil and grease filling his nostrils as he worked on an old Chevy. Joe's voice rang in his ears. "Eric, my boy, you've got a gift with these engines. One day, this shop could be yours." The scene shifted, and he was in his backyard, pushing 8-year-old Maya on the swing he'd built himself. Her laughter filled the air, pure joy radiating from her small face. "Higher, Daddy, higher," she squealed, and Eric obliged, his heart swelling with love. Another memory surfaced. Eric and Alyssa slow dancing in their living room after Maya had gone to bed. The soft music played as they swayed together, Alyssa's head resting on his chest. "I love you, Eric Harper," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes full of adoration. The stark contrast between these cherished memories and his current reality hit Eric like a physical blow. He sank onto his hard bunk, head in his hands, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. A gentle knock on the cell bars pulled Eric from his reverie. He looked up to see Andrew, the older inmate who had become his friend and mentor over the years. "Rough day, kid?" Andrew asked, his weathered face creased with concern. Eric nodded, gesturing for Andrew to come in. "Just thinking about home," he said softly. Andrew sat beside him, his presence a comforting reminder that Eric wasn't alone in this struggle. "I know it's hard," Andrew said, his voice low and understanding. "But you can't let it consume you. Remember what I told you when you first got here?" Eric managed a small smile. "Use this time," he recited. "Don't let it use me." "That's right," Andrew nodded approvingly. "And you've been doing just that. I've seen how hard you've been studying, learning the law. That's going to be your ticket out of here. Mark my words." Eric's thoughts turned to the hours he'd spent in the prison library, poring over legal texts, learning about appeals processes and wrongful convictions. He'd filed several appeals already, each one carefully crafted with the knowledge he'd gained. But every attempt had been blocked, Officer Daniels' false testimony standing like an impenetrable wall between Eric and his freedom. "Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it," Eric admitted, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. "Every appeal gets rejected. It's like banging my head against a brick wall." Andrew's eyes hardened. "Now you listen to me, Eric Harper," he said firmly. "I've been where you are. Wrongfully convicted, years stolen from me. But I never gave up, and neither will you. You keep fighting, you hear me? One day, the truth will come out. Eric nodded, drawing strength from Andrew's words. He remembered the day he'd met Andrew, just a few weeks into his sentence. Eric had been struggling to adjust to prison life, the constant threat of violence, and the loss of his freedom wearing him down. One day, in the prison yard, a group of inmates had cornered Eric, looking for trouble. Just as things were about to turn ugly, Andrew had stepped in, his calm demeanor and respected status diffusing the situation. "You're new here," Andrew had said to Eric afterward. "Stick with me, kid. I'll show you how to survive in this place." True to his word, Andrew had taken Eric under his wing, teaching him the unwritten rules of prison life. More importantly, he'd encouraged Eric to use his time productively, to educate himself, and fight for his freedom. "You know," Eric said, pulling himself back to the present, "I never thanked you properly for everything you've done for me, Andrew." Andrew waved off the gratitude. "No need for thanks. Just promise me you'll keep fighting. And when you get out of here, because you will get out, you'll help others like us. Deal?" Eric nodded solemnly. "Deal." As Andrew left, Eric turned back to his small collection of law books. He picked one up, determination setting his jaw. He might be behind bars, but his mind was free to learn, to grow, to plan for the day when he'd prove his innocence. The next morning, Eric woke early, his body attuned to the prison's rigid schedule. As he went through his daily routine, breakfast in the noisy cafeteria, a shift in the laundry, then lunch, his mind was elsewhere, reviewing legal strategies and planning his next appeal. During his free time in the afternoon, Eric made his way to the prison library. It had become his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in learning and forget, for a few hours, the harsh reality of his surroundings. As he settled at his usual table, a stack of law books before him, Eric caught sight of a new inmate looking lost among the shelves. The young man's scared eyes and nervous demeanor reminded Eric of himself when he'd first arrived. "Hey," Eric called out softly. "You looking for something specific?" The young man startled, then approached cautiously. I don't know," he admitted. "I just thought I should try to learn something while I'm in here." Eric smiled encouragingly. "That's a good start. I'm Eric. Why don't you join me? I can show you some basics about legal research." As Eric guided the newcomer through the basics of legal terminology and research techniques, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. This was what Andrew had meant about helping others. By sharing his knowledge, Eric wasn't just helping this young man. He was reaffirming his own commitment to justice. Later that evening, as Eric sat on his bunk writing a letter to Alyssa and Maya, he reflected on how much he'd changed over the years. The anger and bitterness that had consumed him in the early days of his imprisonment hadn't disappeared entirely, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they had been channeled into a fierce determination to prove his innocence and expose the corruption that had landed him here. He wrote to Maya about her upcoming 14th birthday, his heart aching at the thought of another milestone he'd miss. "I'm so proud of the young woman you're becoming," he wrote. "Keep working hard in school, sweetheart. Education is the key to a better future." To Alyssa, he expressed his undying love and gratitude for her unwavering support. "I couldn't do this without you," he wrote. "Your strength gives me strength. We'll be together again, I promise." As he sealed the envelope, Eric's thoughts turned to Officer Daniels. He wondered if the corrupt cop ever thought about the lives he destroyed with his lies. Did he feel any remorse? Or was he still out there, abusing his power, ruining more innocent lives? The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm Eric, but he took a deep breath, centering himself. Anger wouldn't help him now. He needed to stay focused, to keep learning, to keep fighting. The next day, Eric received news that his latest appeal had been rejected. The familiar sting of disappointment washed over him, but it didn't crush him as it once might have. Instead, he turned to his law books with renewed vigor, determined to find a new angle, a new approach. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, Eric's reputation in the prison grew. Inmates sought him out for legal advice, and even some of the guards began to treat him with a grudging respect. Eric's quiet dignity and unwavering pursuit of justice had earned him a unique status within the prison walls. One afternoon, As Eric was helping another inmate understand the appeals process, a guard approached. "Harper," he called, "you've got a visitor." Eric's heart leaped. Visits were rare and precious. As he was led to the visitation area, he wondered who it could be. Alyssa and Maya weren't due for another month. To his surprise, it was Joe, his old boss from the auto shop. The sight of the gruff but kindly man brought a lump to Eric's throat. "Joe," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you're here." Joe's eyes were moist as he looked at Eric through the glass partition. "Damn, boy," he said gruffly. "You look different." Eric managed a small smile. "Prison will do that to you." They talked for a while, Joe updating Eric on the goings-on at the shop and in the neighborhood. Then, as their time was running out, Joe leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen, Eric," he said, "I want you to know that your job is waiting for you. When you get out of here, and you'll get out, you come straight to the shop, you hear me? We'll get you back on your feet." Eric felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Joe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." As he was led back to his cell, Eric felt a renewed sense of hope. Joe's visit was a reminder that there was still a world out there, a life waiting for him. He just had to keep fighting to get back to it. That night, as Eric lay on his bunk, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond these walls. He saw himself walking out of the prison gates, Alyssa and Maya waiting for him with open arms. He pictured returning to work at Joe's shop, rebuilding his life piece by piece. But more than that, he imagined using his hard-won knowledge and experience to help others who had been wronged by the system. He could see himself advocating for criminal justice reform, fighting to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to others. As he drifted off to sleep, Eric's last thoughts were of his family. "I'm coming home," he whispered into the darkness. "I promise." The years continued to pass, each day a battle against despair and hopelessness. Eric's hair began to gray at the temples, and lines appeared around his eyes, physical manifestations of the toll his imprisonment had taken. But his spirit remained unbroken. Eric's 18th appeal was in progress, and though he tried not to get his hopes up, he couldn't help but feel that this time might be different. He'd uncovered some inconsistencies in Officer Daniel's testimony that he hoped might finally crack open his case. As he waited for news, Eric continued his daily routine. He worked in the prison workshop, studied in the library, and mentored other inmates. Each night, he looked at the photo of Alyssa and Maya, drawing strength from their smiles. One day, as Eric was deep in conversation with Andrew in the prison yard, a guard approached. "Harper," he called, "Warden wants to see you." Eric exchanged a puzzled look with Andrew. A summons to the warden's office was rarely good news. As he followed the guard, Eric's mind raced. Had his appeal been rejected again? Was there news from home? The warden, a stern woman named Harriet Mills, looked up as Eric entered her office. "Sit down, Harper," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Eric sat, his heart pounding. "Is everything all right, Warden?" he asked. Warden Mills regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Eric's shock, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was unmistakably a smile. "Harper," she said, "I've been keeping an eye on you for years now. I've seen how you've conducted yourself, how you've helped other inmates, how you've never stopped fighting for your freedom." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've also seen your appeals, each one more sophisticated than the last. I have to admit, I started to wonder if there might be something to your claims of innocence." Eric sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Was this going where he thought it was going? "I've been in touch with a new prosecutor in the DA's office," Warden Mills continued. "Sandra Marshall. She's been looking into some of Officer Daniel's old cases, and, well, she's found some discrepancies." Eric's heart was racing now. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means, Mr. Harper, that your case is being reopened," the warden said. "Ms. Marshall believes there's enough new evidence to warrant a new trial." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eric gripped the arms of his chair, struggling to process what he was hearing. "A new trial?" he repeated, hardly daring to believe it. Warden Mills nodded. "It's not freedom, not yet. But it's a chance, Harper. A real chance." As Eric walked back to his cell in a daze, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. A new trial. a chance to prove his innocence, a chance to go home. He thought of Alyssa and Maya, of Joe and his old life. He thought of Andrew and all the other inmates he'd befriended over the years. He thought of Officer Daniels, the man whose lies had stolen a decade of his life. And as he entered his cell, Eric Harper did something he hadn't done in years. He sat on his bunk, put his face in his hands, and wept. They were tears of relief, of hope, of all the emotions he'd held back for so long. When Andrew found him later, Eric was sitting quietly, a look of determination on his face. "I heard the news," Andrew said softly. "How are you feeling?" Eric looked up at his friend, his eyes clear and focused. "Ready," he said simply. "Ready to fight. Ready to go home." As night fell over the prison, Eric lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in 10 years, he allowed himself to truly hope. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. He would never stop fighting for the truth. And someday, somehow, justice would prevail. Sandra Marshall rubbed her tired eyes as she pored over yet another case file. As the newly appointed prosecutor for the district, she had inherited a mountain of paperwork, each folder representing a life altered by the justice system. But there was something about this particular case that nagged at her. "Eric Harper," she murmured, flipping through the pages. "Convicted of armed robbery, sentenced to 10 years. Her brow furrowed as she read the details of the case. The evidence seemed solid at first glance, but there was something off about the arresting officer's testimony. Sandra reached for another file, then another. A pattern began to emerge, centered around one name: Officer Rick Daniels. In case after case, Daniels' testimony was pivotal, his evidence always perfectly aligned to secure a conviction. Too perfectly, Sandra realized with growing unease. Determined to uncover the truth, Sandra began digging deeper into Daniels' past cases. She interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and slowly, a disturbing picture began to take shape. Officer Rick Daniels, it seemed, had a history of manipulating evidence and coercing witnesses to close cases quickly. As Sandra delved further into Eric Harper's case, she uncovered a series of inconsistencies that she couldn't ignore. Witness statements that contradicted Daniels' account, timestamps that didn't add up, and most damning of all, security footage from a gas station miles away from the crime scene. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered as she watched the grainy video. There, clear as day, was Eric Harper filling up his car at the exact time the robbery was taking place across town. Her heart raced as the implications sank in. An innocent man had spent years in prison because of a corrupt cop's lies. With trembling hands, Sandra picked up her phone. "Your Honor," she said when Judge Helen Armstrong answered, "I need to speak with you urgently about the Eric Harper case." Hours later, Sandra stood before Judge Armstrong in her chambers, laying out the evidence she had uncovered. The judge listened intently, her face growing more troubled with each revelation. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Ms. Marshall?" Judge Armstrong asked, her voice tight with concern. Sandra nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. The evidence is clear. Eric Harper is innocent, and Officer Daniels has been falsifying evidence and testimony for years." Judge Armstrong sank back in her chair, the weight of the situation evident in her posture. "I sentenced that man to 10 years in prison," she said softly, more to herself than to Sandra. 10 years of his life, gone because I didn't question that officer's testimony more closely. "It's not your fault, Your Honor," Sandra assured her. "Daniels fooled a lot of people for a long time, but now we have a chance to make it right." Judge Armstrong straightened, her resolve visibly strengthening. "You're right, Ms. Marshall. Let's reopen this case immediately. It's time for the truth to come to light." The news of Eric Harper's case being reopened sent shockwaves through the legal community. As the day of the hearing approached, tension built in the courthouse. Reporters camped outside, sensing a big story in the making. Inside the courtroom, Eric sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of calm determination. 10 years in prison had aged him, but there was a quiet strength in his bearing that commanded respect. Beside him, his wife Alyssa clutched his hand, her eyes never leaving his face. As Judge Armstrong entered and took her seat, a hush fell over the room. Sandra Marshall rose, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, New evidence has come to light that not only exonerates Eric Harper, but also reveals a disturbing pattern of misconduct by the arresting officer, Rick Daniels. Sandra proceeded to present her findings, meticulously laying out the trail of deception that had led to Eric's wrongful conviction. As she spoke, gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. And finally, Your Honor, Sandra said, her voice rising with conviction, we have security footage that proves conclusively that Eric Harper was miles away from the scene of the crime at the time of the robbery. As the video played on the courtroom screen, Eric closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the moment he had dreamed of for so long. Judge Armstrong's face was grave as she turned to the prosecution. Does the state wish to call any witnesses? The lead prosecutor stood, his face ashen. Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Officer Rick Daniels to the stand. A ripple of anticipation ran through the courtroom as Daniels took the stand. Gone was the confident swagger he had displayed 10 years ago. Now, he looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. Sandra approached the witness stand, her gaze unwavering. Officer Daniels, can you explain the discrepancies between your testimony in Mr. Harper's original trial and the new evidence we've presented today? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure what you mean. I testified to the best of my recollection. Your recollection? Sandra's voice was sharp. Officer Daniels, we have proof that you fabricated evidence. You planted Mr. Harper's fingerprints on a weapon he never touched. You coerced witnesses into identifying him. How do you explain that? The color drained from Daniels' face. He looked desperately around the courtroom, as if searching for an escape route. I was just trying to do my job, he stammered. Sometimes you have to push things along to get results. A collective gasp went up from the spectators. Sandra pressed on, her voice rising. Push things along? You mean falsify evidence? Lie under oath? Destroy an innocent man's life? Daniels crumbled under the onslaught of questions. You don't understand, he blurted out. The pressure to close cases, and Harper, he fit the profile. I thought. You thought what? Sandra demanded. That because Eric Harper was a black man, he must be guilty? That it was okay to rob him of 10 years of his life based on nothing but your prejudice and desire for a quick win? The courtroom erupted in outrage. Judge Armstrong banged her gavel, calling for order. Officer Daniels, she said, her voice cold with fury, you are hereby held in contempt of court. Bailiff, take him into custody. As Daniels was led away in handcuffs, Judge Armstrong turned to Eric. Her face was etched with remorse. Mr. Harper, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for the grave injustice that has been done to you. In light of this new evidence, I hereby declare you innocent of all charges. You are a free man. The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause. Alyssa threw her arms around Eric, sobbing with joy. Their daughter Maya, now a young woman, rushed forward to join the embrace. But Eric remained calm, his face a study in dignified restraint. As the noise in the courtroom began to subside, he slowly stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady and clear, I want to thank you for allowing the truth to come to light. I hold no ill will towards you or this court. You were deceived, just as I was victimized. What matters now is that justice has finally been served. Judge Armstrong looked at Eric with a mix of admiration and sorrow. Mr. Harper, your grace in the face of such injustice is remarkable. I only wish we could give you back the years that were taken from you. Eric nodded solemnly. Those years are gone, Your Honor. But perhaps my story can serve as a reminder of the importance of truth and the dangers of unchecked power. If it prevents even one person from suffering as I have, then my ordeal will have meaning. As Eric turned to rejoin his family, the entire courtroom rose in a standing ovation. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, but Eric paid them no mind. His focus was solely on Alyssa and Maya, on the life that awaited him beyond these walls. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the news of Eric's exoneration. As he emerged into the sunlight, a free man at last, cheers erupted from the assembled onlookers. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Eric remained composed. He stood tall, Alyssa on one side and Maya on the other, facing the world with quiet dignity. Mr. Harper, one reporter called out. How do you feel about Officer Daniels' confession? Eric paused, considering his words carefully. I feel vindicated, he said finally. But more than that, I feel a deep sadness. Officer Daniels' actions didn't just harm me and my family. They eroded public trust in law enforcement and the justice system. That's a wound that will take time to heal. Another reporter pushed forward. What are your plans now, Mr. Harper? A small smile tugged at Eric's lips. First, I'm going to spend time with my family. I have a lot of catching up to do. He squeezed Alyssa's hand and smiled at Maya. But after that, I plan to work towards reforming the system that failed me. No one should have to endure what I've been through. As the family made their way through the crowd, well-wishers reached out to pat Eric on the back or shake his hand. The atmosphere was one of joy tinged with solemnity, a recognition of both the triumph of justice and the tragedy of its delay. Back at home, Eric stood in the doorway of the house he hadn't seen in 10 years. Everything looked both familiar and strange, a time capsule of the life he'd left behind. Maya's childhood toys still scattered in the corner, family photos on the walls showing a younger, carefree version of himself. Welcome home, Dad, Maya said softly, squeezing his arm. Eric pulled her into a hug, marveling at how much she'd grown. It's good to be home, sweetheart, he murmured. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Judge Helen Armstrong's office as she paced nervously, her usually composed demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. She glanced at the clock for the 100th time, her heart racing as she awaited Eric Harper's arrival. The weight of her role in his wrongful imprisonment pressed heavily upon her shoulders. A soft knock on the door made her start. Come in, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric Harper entered, his presence filling the room with a quiet dignity that took Judge Armstrong's breath away. Gone was the angry, confused young man she had sentenced 10 years ago. In his place stood a man who had been tempered by injustice, but not broken by it. Mr. Harper, Judge Armstrong began, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Eric nodded, his face unreadable. Of course, Your Honor. Judge Armstrong gestured to a chair. Please sit down. As Eric took a seat, Judge Armstrong remained standing, unable to contain her nervous energy. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. Mr. Harper, she began, her eyes meeting his. I don't even know where to begin. The injustice you've suffered, the years stolen from you. And I played a part in that. Eric sat silently, his steady gaze encouraging her to continue. I want you to know, Judge Armstrong went on, her voice thick with emotion, that I never imagined. I trusted the system. I trusted Officer Daniels' word. It never occurred to me that he could be so deeply corrupt. Tears welled up in her eyes as the full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. I sentenced you to 10 years in prison. 10 years. And all that time, you were innocent. I can't even begin to comprehend the pain and suffering you've endured because of my failure to see the truth. Judge Armstrong's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she sank into her chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I'm so sorry, Mr. Harper, she whispered. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly, deeply sorry. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was Judge Armstrong's muffled weeping. Eric sat quietly, his face a mask of calm, as he watched the woman who had changed the course of his life break down before him. Finally, Eric leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Judge Armstrong, he said, causing her to look up at him through tear-filled eyes. I forgive you. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment, Judge Armstrong wasn't sure she had heard correctly. You forgive me? She repeated, disbelief evident in her voice. Eric nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Yes, I forgive you. You see, Judge Armstrong, I've had a lot of time to think about forgiveness over the past 10 years. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. At first, I was angry. So angry. At Officer Daniels, at the system, at you. That anger ate away at me, threatened to destroy whatever was left of the man I used to be. Judge Armstrong listened intently, hardly daring to breathe. But then I realized something, Eric went on. Holding on to that anger was only hurting me more. It wasn't changing my situation, wasn't bringing me any closer to freedom or justice. It was just poisoning me from the inside out. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he recalled his journey. So I made a choice. I chose to let go of that anger, to focus instead on what I could control, my actions, my thoughts, my spirit. Eric's gaze returned to Judge Armstrong, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and confusion. You see, Judge Armstrong, you were as much a victim of Officer Daniel's deception as I was. You trusted in a system that was supposed to deliver justice, and that trust was betrayed. Judge Armstrong shook her head, struggling to comprehend Eric's words. But I should have known better, she protested. I should have questioned more, looked deeper. Eric held up a hand, silencing her. Perhaps, but you can't change the past. Neither can I. What we can do is learn from it, grow from it, and work to ensure it doesn't happen to others. He leaned forward again, his eyes intense. During my time in prison, I learned about resilience. I educated myself about the law, about my rights, and I used that knowledge to help other inmates understand their legal rights too. In a way, my wrongful imprisonment became a twisted kind of gift. It gave me a purpose, a way to make a difference even from behind bars. Judge Armstrong listened in amazement, marveling at the strength and wisdom of the man before her. This was not the bitter, broken ex-convict she had expected to face. This was a man who had taken the worst life could throw at him and transformed it into something powerful and meaningful. Mr. Harper, she said softly, your capacity for forgiveness, it's extraordinary. I don't know if I could be so gracious in your position. Eric smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. Forgiveness isn't about being gracious, Judge Armstrong. It's about freedom. By forgiving you, by letting go of my anger towards a system that failed me, I free myself from the prison of bitterness and resentment. I choose to move forward, to focus on creating positive change rather than dwelling on past injustices. As the full impact of Eric's words sank in, Judge Armstrong felt something break inside her. The guilt, the shame, the self-recrimination she had been carrying since the truth about Eric's case came to light. It all came rushing out in a flood of tears. She wept openly, overwhelmed by Eric's unexpected forgiveness and the profound wisdom of his words. Eric, moved by her genuine remorse, reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's okay, he said gently. Let it out. This is part of the healing process, for both of us. For several minutes, they sat in silence, Judge Armstrong's sobs gradually subsiding. When she finally looked up, her eyes red and puffy, she saw Eric watching her with compassion. Thank you, she whispered. Your forgiveness. It means more than you can know. Eric nodded. I hope it helps you find peace, Judge Armstrong. And I hope it inspires you to look at cases that come before you with new eyes. To always question, always dig deeper, always remember that behind every case file is a human being whose life hangs in the balance. Judge Armstrong straightened in her chair, a new resolve settling over her features. I promise you, Mr. Harper, I will never forget this lesson. Your story, your forgiveness, they will guide every decision I make from this day forward. As their meeting drew to a close, Judge Armstrong felt a profound shift within herself. The burden of guilt she had carried was not gone entirely, but it had been transformed. In its place was a fierce determination to use her position to fight for true justice, to be a force for positive change within the system. Eric rose to leave, but paused at the door. Judge Armstrong, he said, turning back to face her. Remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase the past or negate the need for change. It's a starting point, not an ending. Judge Armstrong nodded solemnly. I understand, Mr. Harper, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. As Eric left her office, Judge Armstrong sat back in her chair, her mind reeling from the encounter. She had expected anger, perhaps even hatred. Instead, she had been given a masterclass in forgiveness, resilience, and the true meaning of justice. She thought about the power of Eric's choice, to forgive rather than seek revenge, to use his pain as a catalyst for change rather than a reason for bitterness. It was a choice that required immense strength, a strength that went beyond anything the legal system could measure or quantify. In that moment, Judge Helen Armstrong made a choice of her own. She would honor Eric's forgiveness by becoming a tireless advocate for justice reform. She would use her position to scrutinize every case that came before her, to question every piece of evidence, to never again take an officer's word as absolute truth. As she looked out her office window at the city below, Judge Armstrong felt a renewed sense of purpose. Eric Harper's unexpected act of forgiveness had not only redeemed her, it had reignited her passion for justice and reminded her of the profound responsibility she held as a judge. She picked up her phone and dialed her clerk. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day," she said. "I have some research to do on wrongful convictions and justice reform." As she hung up the phone, Judge Armstrong felt a sense of peace wash over her. Eric Harper had given her more than forgiveness. He had given her a second chance to truly serve justice, and she was determined not to waste it. Meanwhile, as Eric walked out of the courthouse, he felt a lightness in his step that he hadn't experienced in years. The act of forgiving Judge Armstrong had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the pain, the anger, the long nights in his prison cell when hope seemed like a distant memory. But he also thought about the strength he had found within himself, the wisdom he had gained, and the purpose he had discovered. As he stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, Eric took a deep breath, savoring the sweet taste of freedom. He had forgiven Judge Armstrong not just for her sake, but for his own. In choosing forgiveness over vengeance, he had liberated himself from the last vestiges of his emotional prison. Eric knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There was still much work to be done to reform the justice system, to prevent others from suffering as he had. But he felt ready for the challenge, armed with the powerful weapons of forgiveness and resilience. As he walked home to his family, Eric Harper smiled. He had entered Judge Armstrong's office as a man who had been wronged by the system. He left as a man who had the power to change it. And that, he realized, was the true meaning of justice. As Eric Harper walked away from the courthouse, the weight of his conversation with Judge Armstrong still lingering in his mind, he found himself at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. The busy street before him bustled with life, a stark contrast to the rigid routines of prison that had defined his existence for the past decade. He stood there for a moment, letting the sounds and sights of freedom wash over him, before deciding to take the long way home. His feet carried him through familiar neighborhoods that had changed in subtle ways during his absence. New storefronts, fresh coats of paint on old houses, trees that had grown taller, all served as reminders of the time he had lost. Yet, as he walked, Eric felt not bitterness, but a growing sense of purpose. The sun was setting as Eric finally reached his front porch. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, taking a deep breath before entering. The house was quiet, but the aroma of home-cooked food filled the air, bringing a smile to his face. "Dad?" Maya's voice called out from the kitchen. "Is that you?" Eric made his way to the kitchen, where he found his daughter stirring a pot on the stove. At 18, Maya was no longer the little girl he'd left behind, but a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. The sight of her cooking dinner, so grown up and responsible, brought a lump to Eric's throat. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "Something smells good." Maya turned, a wooden spoon still in her hand, and smiled. "I'm making your favorite, Mom's recipe for beef stew. I hope I'm doing it justice." Eric crossed the room and enveloped his daughter in a hug. "I'm sure it's perfect," he murmured into her hair. As they broke apart, Maya studied her father's face. "How did it go with Judge Armstrong?" she asked hesitantly. Eric sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "It was intense, emotional, but I think it was necessary, for both of us." Maya nodded, turning back to the stove. Did you forgive her?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Eric answered. "Yes, I did. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do." Maya was quiet for a long moment, stirring the stew thoughtfully. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I could have done that. Sometimes I still feel so angry about what happened to our family." Eric moved to stand beside his daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to feel angry, Maya. What happened to us, to me, it wasn't fair. But holding on to that anger, it doesn't hurt anyone but ourselves. Maya looked up at her father, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. How do you do it, Dad? How do you stay so strong? Eric smiled softly, pulling Maya into another embrace. I'm not always strong, sweetheart. There were days in prison when I felt like I was drowning in anger and despair. But I realized that if I let those feelings consume me, I'd be giving up the one thing they couldn't take away, my spirit. As they stood there in the warm kitchen, the aroma of beef stew filling the air, Eric felt a surge of love for his daughter. Despite everything she'd been through, she had grown into a compassionate, thoughtful young woman. He silently vowed to make up for all the lost time, to be the father she deserved. The sound of the front door opening broke the moment. I'm home, Alyssa's voice called out. Eric and Maya shared a smile before calling back in unison. We're in the kitchen. Alyssa appeared in the doorway, her arms full of grocery bags. Her face lit up at the sight of Eric and Maya together. Well, isn't this a beautiful sight? She said, her voice warm with affection. As the family sat down to dinner, Eric couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt, as if the past 10 years had been nothing but a bad dream. Yet, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There were wounds that needed healing, trust that needed rebuilding. Over bowls of steaming stew, Eric shared the details of his meeting with Judge Armstrong. Alyssa listened intently, her hand finding Eric's under the table and squeezing it supportively. So, what happens now? Alyssa asked as Eric finished his account. Eric took a deep breath, his eyes moving from his wife to his daughter. Now we move forward, but not just for ourselves. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with my life, now that I have it back. Maya leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. What do you mean, Dad? I want to help others who've been wrongfully convicted, Eric said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I want to use my experience, my knowledge, to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Alyssa nodded, a proud smile spreading across her face. I think that's a wonderful idea, honey. But where do you start? Eric leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing with possibilities. I've made some connections in prison, other inmates who are fighting their own wrongful convictions. And there are organizations out there that work on these issues. I think I'll start by reaching out to them, see how I can get involved. As the conversation continued, plans began to take shape. Maya suggested starting a blog to share Eric's story and raise awareness about wrongful convictions. Alyssa, who had kept Eric's old laptop safe during his incarceration, offered to help him set it up. Later that night, as Eric lay in bed beside Alyssa, sleep eluding him, he found himself reflecting on the day's events. The meeting with Judge Armstrong, dinner with his family, the plans for the future. It all felt surreal, like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. Alyssa stirred beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. Can't sleep? She murmured. Eric turned to face her, barely able to make out her features in the dim light. Just thinking, he replied softly. About what? Eric was quiet for a moment, trying to put his swirling thoughts into words. About how different everything is now. About how much I've missed. About whether I'm ready for all of this. Alyssa propped herself up on one elbow, her free hand gently caressing Eric's face. Oh, honey, she said, her voice full of love and understanding. You don't have to be ready for everything all at once. We'll take it one day at a time, okay? Eric nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. I don't know what I'd do without you, Alyssa, he whispered. You've been so strong through all of this. Alyssa leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Eric's lips. We've been strong together, she corrected him. And we'll keep being strong together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a family. As Eric finally drifted off to sleep, Alyssa's words echoed in his mind. Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a family. It was a promise, a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the uncertain future that lay ahead. The next morning, Eric woke early, his body still attuned to the rigid schedule of prison life. He made his way downstairs, careful not to wake Alyssa or Maya, and found himself drawn to the backyard. The early morning air was crisp, the grass wet with dew beneath his bare feet. Eric closed his eyes, taking deep breaths, savoring the simple pleasure of being outside without walls or fences to constrain him. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Eric's mind turned to the task ahead. He knew that the path he had chosen, to fight for justice reform and help others who had been wrongfully convicted, would not be an easy one. But he felt a sense of purpose, a fire in his belly that he hadn't felt in years. The sound of the back door opening broke Eric from his reverie. He turned to see Joe, his old boss from the auto shop, standing on the porch. "Thought I might find you out here," Joe said, a warm smile on his weathered face. "Mind if I join you?" Eric gestured for Joe to come closer. "Of course not. What brings you by so early?" Joe stepped off the porch, coming to stand beside Eric. "Wanted to catch you before you got busy with your day. Got something I want to talk to you about." Eric raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh." Joe nodded, his expression serious. "Remember what I said when I visited you in prison? About your job being waiting for you?" "I remember," Eric said softly, touched by the memory of Joe's unwavering support. "Well, I've been thinking," Joe continued. "The offer still stands. You've always got a place at the shop if you want it. But I've also been following the news, hearing about your plans to work on justice reform." Eric nodded, wondering where Joe was going with this. "So, I had an idea," Joe said, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. "What if we used the shop as a base for your work? We got that old office in the back that's just collecting dust. We could fix it up, make it a proper workspace for you. And maybe we could even start a program, to help ex-cons get back on their feet. Teach them a trade." Eric stared at Joe, momentarily speechless. Of all the things he had expected from this conversation, this wasn't it. "Joe," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. That's incredible. But are you sure? It's a big risk mixing business with something like this." Joe clapped a hand on Eric's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Son, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You're like family to me. And family takes risks for each other. Besides," he added with a wink, "I reckon having a local hero working out of my shop might be good for business." Eric laughed, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I don't know about hero," he said, shaking his head. "But I'm grateful, Joe. More than I can say." As Joe left, promising to start cleaning out the old office that very day, Eric felt a renewed sense of hope. With Joe's support, he had a solid foundation from which to start his work. It wasn't just a vague idea anymore. It was becoming real. Over the next few weeks, Eric threw himself into his new mission with the same determination that had sustained him through his years in prison. The old office at Joe's auto shop was transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Walls that had once been bare were now covered with maps, statistics, and case files. A donated computer hummed in the corner, its screen often displaying Maya's newly created blog, Justice for the Wrongfully Convicted. Eric's days were filled with phone calls, research, and meetings. He reached out to advocacy groups, offering his unique perspective as someone who had lived through wrongful conviction. He pored over case files, looking for inconsistencies that might help overturn unjust verdicts. And, true to Joe's suggestion, he began working with local ex-cons, teaching them the basics of auto repair and helping them navigate the challenges of reintegrating into society. One afternoon, as Eric was deep in conversation with a potential volunteer, a familiar face appeared in the doorway of his office. "Mr. Harper?" Sandra Marshall, the prosecutor who had reopened Eric's case, stood there, a tentative smile on her face. "Do you have a moment?" Eric excused himself from his conversation and invited Sandra in. "Ms. Marshall, this is a surprise. What can I do for you?" Sandra took a seat, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of Eric's office. "I've been following your work," she said, gesturing to the walls covered in case information. "It's impressive." Eric leaned back in his chair, studying Sandra's face. There was something in her expression, a mix of admiration and something else. Guilt, perhaps? "Thank you," he said simply. "But I have a feeling you didn't come all this way just to compliment my wall decorations." Sandra chuckled, but the sound was strained. "You're right, of course." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Mr. Harper, I want to apologize." Eric raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Apologize? For what?" "You're the one who helped prove my innocence." Sandra shook her head. "Not for that. for not seeing the truth sooner, for being part of a system that failed you so spectacularly. She paused, her eyes meeting Eric's. And I want to make it right. How? Eric asked, leaning forward, intrigued. I want to help, Sandra said, her voice gaining strength. Your work here, it's important. And I think I could bring something valuable to it. My knowledge of the legal system, my connections in the prosecutor's office. Eric sat back, considering Sandra's words. The idea of working alongside a prosecutor, even one who had helped exonerate him, was not something he had considered. But he couldn't deny the potential benefits. It won't be easy, Eric warned. A lot of the people we're trying to help, they might not trust someone from the prosecutor's office. Sandra nodded, her expression resolute. I understand, but I'm willing to work for that trust, to prove that not everyone in the system is corrupt or indifferent. Eric was quiet for a long moment, weighing the pros and cons. Finally, he extended his hand across the desk. All right, Ms. Marshall, let's give it a try. As they shook hands, Eric couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns his life had taken. From wrongfully convicted prisoner to working alongside the very people who had once put him behind bars. It was a journey he never could have imagined. The partnership with Sandra proved to be a turning point for Eric's work. Her legal expertise and insider knowledge of the prosecution process opened doors that had previously been closed to him. Together, they began to make real progress on several cases of potential wrongful conviction. As word of their work spread, more and more people began to reach out. Families of incarcerated individuals, lawyers looking for expert consultation, even a few brave police officers who wanted to help reform the system from within. Eric's little office at Joe's auto shop became a beacon of hope for those who had been failed by the justice system. But with increased visibility came increased challenges. Not everyone was happy about Eric's work. There were those in law enforcement and the legal community who saw him as a troublemaker, someone upsetting the status quo. Threatening letters began to arrive at the shop, and more than once, Eric arrived in the morning to find graffiti scrawled across the building. Through it all, Eric remained steadfast. The threats and intimidation tactics only served to reinforce his belief in the importance of his work. And with every small victory, every case reopened, every wrongfully convicted person freed, he felt a sense of purpose that he had never known before. One evening, as Eric was preparing to lock up the office for the night, he received an unexpected visitor. Judge Helen Armstrong stood in the doorway, looking both determined and slightly uncomfortable. Judge Armstrong, Eric said, surprised. What brings you here? The judge stepped into the office, her eyes taking in the same scene that had impressed Sandra weeks earlier. I've been hearing about your work, Mr. Harper. It's quite something you've built here. Eric nodded, waiting for her to continue. He could sense that she hadn't come just to offer praise. Judge Armstrong took a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. About justice, about the flaws in our system, about the role I've played in perpetuating those flaws. She paused, her eyes meeting Eric's. I want to help, if you'll have me. Eric studied the judge's face, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He thought back to their emotional meeting in her office, to the tears she had shed and the promise she had made to do better. It won't be easy, Eric warned, echoing his words to Sandra. There will be people who won't understand why you're working with us. It could affect your career. Judge Armstrong nodded, a wry smile on her face. I'm counting on it. It's time for some changes in our courtrooms, Mr. Harper. And I think working with you might be the best way to make those changes happen. As Eric shook hands with Judge Armstrong, sealing their new partnership, he felt a sense of coming full circle. The very people who had once been part of his wrongful conviction were now joining him in the fight for justice reform. That night, as Eric shared the news of Judge Armstrong's offer with Alyssa and Maya over dinner, he felt a swell of emotion. Looking at the faces of his wife and daughter, seeing the pride and love shining in their eyes, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. You know, Maya said, a thoughtful expression on her face, when you first told us about wanting to work on justice reform, I was worried. I thought it might mean you'd be reliving your trauma every day. Eric reached across the table and took Maya's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I understand your concern, sweetheart. There are days when it's tough, when the memories come flooding back. But helping others, fighting for justice, it's healing in its own way. It's given me purpose. Alyssa nodded, her eyes shining with pride. And you're making a real difference, honey. The work you're doing with Sandra and now Judge Armstrong. It's incredible. As the family continued their dinner, discussing the latest developments in Eric's work, a news alert pinged on Maya's phone. She glanced at it, her eyes widening. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to see this." Eric took the phone, his heart racing as he read the headline. Former Officer Rick Daniels arrested on multiple charges of evidence tampering and perjury. The article detailed how an internal investigation, sparked by Eric's case, had uncovered a pattern of misconduct stretching back years. Daniels had been taken into custody that afternoon, facing charges that could result in decades behind bars. For a moment, Eric sat in stunned silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh, a deep, cathartic laugh that seemed to release years of pent-up tension. "Dad?" Maya asked, concern evident in her voice. "Are you okay?" Eric wiped tears from his eyes, nodding. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine. It's just, after all this time, to see justice finally being served." Alyssa reached out, taking Eric's hand. "How do you feel about this, honey? Really?" Eric took a deep breath, considering the question. "Honestly, I thought I'd feel more vindictive. But mostly, I'm just relieved. Relieved that he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me." The family spent the rest of the evening discussing the implications of Daniel's arrest. For Eric, it was a validation of everything he'd been working towards. But it also served as a reminder of all the work still to be done. The next morning, Eric arrived at his office earlier than usual. As he unlocked the door, his mind was already racing with plans. Daniel's arrest had opened up new possibilities, new avenues to explore in other cases of potential wrongful conviction. As he settled at his desk, Eric's eyes fell on a familiar file, one he'd been meaning to revisit for weeks. It belonged to Andrew, his old friend and mentor from prison. Despite Eric's best efforts, Andrew's case had proven to be particularly challenging, with little concrete evidence of his innocence. Inspired by the breakthrough in his own case, Eric pulled Andrew's file towards him, determined to find something, anything, that might help his friend. As he pored over the documents for what felt like the 100th time, a detail caught his eye. It was small, easily overlooked, but it made Eric's heart race. In the original police report, there was a mention of security camera footage from a convenience store near the scene of the crime. But in all the court documents and evidence logs, there was no further mention of this footage. It was as if it had simply disappeared. Eric reached for his phone, his fingers flying over the keypad as he dialed Sandra's number. "Sandra," he said as soon as she picked up, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need your help. I think I've found something in Andrew's case." Over the next few weeks, Eric and Sandra worked tirelessly on Andrew's case. They tracked down the owner of the convenience store, who confirmed that the police had indeed taken the security footage. But when they tried to obtain a copy from the police department, they hit a wall of bureaucracy and excuses. It wasn't until Judge Armstrong got involved, using her authority to cut through the red tape, that they finally made progress. The footage, long thought lost or destroyed, was found buried in an evidence locker. And what it showed changed everything. The grainy video clearly showed Andrew entering the store at the exact time the crime he was convicted of was taking place across town. It was irrefutable evidence of his innocence, evidence that had been deliberately suppressed. With this new information, Eric and his team were able to fast-track a motion for a new trial. The day Andrew walked out of prison, a free man after 15 years of wrongful imprisonment, was one of the proudest moments of Eric's life. As Eric embraced his old friend outside the prison gates, tears streaming down both their faces, he felt a sense of completion. He had kept his promise, not just to Andrew, but to himself. "I told you I'd get you out," Eric said, his voice choked with emotion. Andrew, his hair now gray and his face lined with years of hardship, smiled through his tears. "I never doubted you for a second, kid." The media frenzy that followed Andrew's exoneration and the revelation of further police misconduct brought Eric's work into the national spotlight. Suddenly, he was being invited to speak at law schools, to testify before state legislatures, to share his story and his mission with a wider audience. It was overwhelming at times, but Eric never lost sight of why he was doing this work. Every time he felt tired or discouraged, he thought of Andrew, of all the others still fighting to prove their innocence, and he found the strength to keep going. As the months passed, Eric's organization grew. What had started as a one-man operation in a small office at Joe's auto shop had blossomed into a full-fledged nonprofit with a team of dedicated lawyers, investigators, and advocates. 1 year to the day after his own exoneration, Eric stood before a crowd gathered for the grand opening of the Harper Center for Justice Reform. The building, a renovated warehouse not far from Joe's shop, would serve as a hub for their expanded operations. As Eric prepared to cut the ribbon, he looked out at the faces in the crowd. There was Alyssa and Maya, beaming with pride. Joe, standing tall despite his advancing years. Sandra and Judge Armstrong, now integral parts of his team. And Andrew, finally able to start rebuilding his life. A wise man once told me, Eric began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, that when you get out of prison, you come straight to the shop. That there be a place for you, a chance to get back on your feet. He smiled at Joe, who nodded back, his eyes glistening. Today, we're opening more than just a building. We're opening a door to justice, to redemption, to hope. For every person who has been wrongly convicted, for every family torn apart by a broken system, this place will stand as a beacon of hope. Eric paused, looking down at the ribbon in his hands. But this center, this work, it's not about me. It's about all of us. It's about building a justice system that truly serves justice. It's about creating a world where what happened to me, to Andrew, to countless others, never happens again. With a final nod to the crowd, Eric cut the ribbon. As cheers erupted, he felt Alyssa's arm slip around his waist, Maya's hand grasping his. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," Maya whispered. Eric pulled his family close, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the depths of despair in a prison cell to standing here, surrounded by love and purpose, it was more than he could have ever imagined. As the celebration continued around them, Eric's thoughts turned to the future. There was still so much work to be done, so many lives to touch, so many wrongs to right. But looking at the faces of his loved ones, his friends, his team, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. The Harper Center for Justice Reform stood as a testament to the power of resilience, of forgiveness, of never giving up in the face of injustice. And for Eric Harper, it was just the beginning backslash. And that's the powerful story of Eric, a tale of resilience, forgiveness, and the fight for justice. Thanks to his determination and the uncovering of a corrupt officer's lies, Eric not only reclaimed his freedom, but also paved the way for justice and accountability. If this story of strength and redemption moved you, let us know in the comments below. We hope it serves as a reminder that even in the face of injustice, resilience and truth can prevail. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.